Hi, I'm Diana Giselle Yanez, host of Highly Sensitive Money. I'm a money coach, certified financial planner, and a highly sensitive person who brings money and social justice together. If you're someone who feels deeply, can endlessly think through how one decision affects everything else, or has ever struggled with all the things that traditional financial thinking leaves out, you're in the right place. In this show, I chat with highly sensitive people on how they handle their money, and with money experts on how they cultivate social justice in their work. Questions? Please go to allthecolors.net and schedule a free 30-minute call. And I'm happy to share resources on investment management, money coaching, workshops, or anything else money and social justice related. Join us in this episode as we explore money and sensitivity while honoring that all of our well-being is interconnected. Today, we're joined by Della Duncan, a renegade economist whose work invites us to reimagine what success, value, and right livelihood can look like. We explore what happens when we move upstream beyond individual struggle toward the root causes of economic injustice, and how that shift can be both liberating and deeply grounding. Della shares powerful insights about living in alignment with our values, questioning the growth at all cost mindset, and finding enough in a world built on scarcity. We talk about spiritual practices that help us stay present with grief and overwhelm, and how community, more than money, can be the most meaningful investment we make. This conversation is a gentle but radical invitation to remember our interconnectedness, to choose power with instead of power over, and to become ancestors worth remembering. Della, it's such a joy to see you. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here.
And I'll share a snippet of how we met. So we met through a class you were teaching at Gaia. I believe it was on Right Livelihood, which is one of your many specialties. And this was back in 2021. And ever since, I've just been like in your orbit, seeing what you've been doing. So it feels like truly a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you. Yeah, so happy that we connected and we've stayed in touch.
Can you introduce your work?
Yeah. So I would say that in my regenerative livelihood garden, I have many plants. The title of my garden would be Renegade Economist, and all the ways that that manifests or comes through are serving as a right livelihood coach for individuals, so helping folks align their work with their values, hosting the Upstream podcast about alternative economics, so fellow podcast host here, and then teaching about alternative economics, whether it's regenerative economics, cooperative, Buddhist, feminist economics, etc. And working with Dr. Fritjof Capra, holding a course called The Systems View of Life. And also, I would say, serving my local community here, and also taking care of my mom who has, needs as she ages. Just adding that some of the ways that we contribute are not always monetized. So I'm adding that. And I am soon to be a parent. So that's another plant in my livelihood garden that is currently growing and that I'm excited about. But yeah, so I'd say those are all of the areas of the work that I'm doing today.
One of the capacities that I've worked with you in is the right livelihood coaching. And what stands out so much to me is that you're, like you said, right? There's many different plants in the way that you're doing things, and you're questioning capitalism and the way that we can be so extractive with ourselves, especially as entrepreneurs. I would love to know, how did you get to doing that kind of work, or doing the many types of things that you do now?
Yeah. So after college, my first job was working at a rape crisis center, so supporting survivors of sexual violence. And as you can imagine, that work was very difficult. But what touched me at the time was actually not so much the content of the work we were doing, but how little value our work had in the economy that we were embedded in. And so I heard this metaphor called the Upstream metaphor at that time, which comes from public health. And the metaphor is about not just supporting the kind of crises of our time, but going upstream to the root causes to really ask, why is it that we have homelessness and inequality and climate change? And so I took that invitation to go upstream from why was it that our current economic system valued some work, like exorbitantly, and other work like teaching or working as a rape crisis counselor, not at all. And so I've been on a journey upstream since that time. And that's what's led me to become a renegade economist, because I've found that when I've gone upstream, so many of the challenges of our time are related to these assumptions underlying mainstream economic thinking about who we are as humans, about our relationship with the more than human world, about work, about money, about value, about progress, about development. And so from that place, all these ways of changing our economic system, of unlearning what we've learned about mainstream economic thinking, and of really supporting our work as agents of that change. That's kind of how I came to do all of these elements and how I came to be a renegade economist.
Yeah. So I remember in Bhutan, you were looking at gross national happiness and just questioning a lot of the assumptions that we have. You recently had a Reimagining Success workshop with Maureen Fallon-Sir, and I'll link it to this, about what are the different ways that we can measure success instead of it only being financial.
Yeah. So that point around, what is the goal of the economy and how do we measure success, right? How do we measure success about in our individual lives, but also our businesses and also our economies, right? There's some very mainstream assumptions that growth is good and that what we want to grow are things like profit or income or wealth or gross domestic product, right? So it's on all these levels of our economy. And so what you're alluding to is this beautiful body of work. We could call it the post-growth movement or the well-being economy movement, but just folks that are saying, hey, is growth and, growth of income, profit, or gross domestic product, is that really the end goal? Is that really what's most important to us? And actually, if something more like happiness or health or well-being, if that's what's really most important to us, and not just human, but planetary or ecological health and well-being, then we actually need alternative measurements, right? We need alternative indicators. As my mentor, Dr. Ha-Bin To, who was the former program director of the Gross National Happiness Index, would say, he said, we're attentive to what we measure. We're attentive to what we measure. So sometimes we're not even aware of what we're measuring as success or development. And so to make visible, to make known what it is we're measuring, and then to choose what it is that really is most important to us and what it is that we actually would like to grow, that we'd actually like to have flourish in our lives and our ecosystems. So that's a little bit about that workshop, but also just in general, like what this means to be a renegade economist.
And the many ways that you help people, either through one-on-one or workshops or facilitating ongoing teaching. Okay. And one of the questions that's coming up for me is, when people are so focused on survival, it can be really hard to question the assumptions that society has or the assumptions that they themselves have. Do you think about the upstream issue of like, how much space do people actually have to question assumptions?
Absolutely. So I want to draw from something, it can be called the Kahneman curve, but it's Daniel Kahneman's work where he found that income and happiness are correlated until a certain amount. So just to, say your point, if you really don't have enough to meet your basic needs, then you are precarious and you are struggling to, whether it's food or housing or, get your basic needs met. So just to say, like, yes, income and happiness are correlated until a certain amount. And then the good news from their research is that it plateaus, meaning there is a point of enoughness where we can say, I have enough. And now what's important to me? And I don't need to continue growing. So it is true that before that enoughness, we have a lot of stress in our bodies, in our physical bodies, but also in our communities, right? And so it can be harder to question assumptions and do this kind of more interrogation and unlearning type of research. So I will say, yes, that is true. And at the same time, even when one is not at that point of enoughness, when one does not have enough or their basic needs met, I do find that this practice of unlearning and of understanding economics to be very liberating, right? Because what it does is it takes the pressure off of us as individuals. We get to learn that there's not something wrong with me. It's not like, oh, I should have pulled harder on my bootstraps, or, I'm not good enough, or I'm not smart enough, or I'm not working hard enough. No, we actually learn that it's systemic. This built-in scarcity, that there is only one corner office, or the way that money is created and lent into existence. So just to say that, like, both and, yes, it is hard to interrogate, challenge, and question and unlearn when we are feeling this sense of precariousness and our basic needs are not met. And it can also be liberating just to do this work, to unlearn mainstream economic thinking, and also know that there are these alternatives. There have been these alternatives, and there are right now around the world people who are fighting to make economic systems more democratic, regenerative, and just.
And one of the ones that you're very intimately involved with is the donut economics in California. Could you introduce people to that program?
Yeah, so in this vein of post-growth economics that I introduced earlier, this idea of growth not being the end goal, but maybe a means to an end, or something that may serve something like health or happiness for people on the planet. One of those initiatives is donut economics. And so this comes from Kate Raworth, who was actually called a renegade economist, and that's where I got the name Renegade Economist from. And she wrote a book called Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. And then she also created a learning community, a global learning community called the Donut Economics Action Lab. And so it's a group of people all around the world who've joined that community to bring this alternative goal to life. And what is the donut? So the donut it's a visual tool. It's a measurement tool. It's a policy screening tool. It's an alternative goal of the economy. It's a coalition builder. But the actual image of the donut, if you imagine the donut hole, right, the center of the donut, imagine it is the meeting of the human needs of the economy that you are in. So wherever you are. So I know you're in Mexico City. So you could imagine, are the human needs in Mexico City being met? And you might shade in, how is the water needs being met? How is the education needs, the housing needs, etc. But it's not enough to only think about our human needs. We also must think in relation to our ecologies, our bioregions, right? Our watersheds. And so the outer ring of the donut are the ecological needs, right? And they come from the planetary boundaries. But you can also look at this for Mexico City. You could say, how well is Mexico City doing in relation to the water needs of Mexico City, in relation to the biodiversity, right? the diversity of beings in Mexico City. What about carbon emissions, right? And so you can also shade whether Mexico City is being responsible in terms of staying within the needs or the capacity of your ecological system. And so the shape that emerges is the donut. The actual donut is the safe and just space for humanity. And the goal of donut economics is to get our economies within the donut, where all of the human needs are met, but we're staying within the needs of our ecosystems. So that's the donut image. And I came to know it through Kate Raworth and her work, and joined the Donut Economics Action Lab. And then groups of people nearby me in California who were also inspired by this, we all came together. We ended up creating a nonprofit, a worker self-directed nonprofit, to kind of embody the donut economics principles in our ways of working. And then we created a snapshot of California, meaning that image of how is California doing? How is it doing at the meeting of the human needs, and how is it doing in relation with our ecological needs in the more than human world? So we released that last fall, and then this year we've been really localizing the donut in more smaller scales. So we have 2 cities that we're working in, and we're also doing a bunch of educational campaigns, but really just bringing the donut economics to life. And again, we're part of a larger global ecosystem and always learning and always growing, but it really has been beautiful to bring this kind of theory, this idea, into practice, into life where I live.
Yeah, that is really, really beautiful. And I know that one of the ways that we can kind of battle overwhelm or feeling apathetic because the problems are too big is by taking action, right? Finding other
Absolutely.
people locally that you can take action with. And I think I've shared with you, and I know I shared with you in the prep, but as someone who's like very sensitive to inequality and like people not having what they need, my earliest strategy was actually to just like not pay attention, to just be completely ostrich. And there's like a lot of shame that I moved through in that. And personally, I began to feel more equipped to start to ask these bigger questions when I was being supported spiritually by my Quaker meeting. It was so interesting, that feeling actually really rooted in a practice of like 400 years that they've been doing the different social justice things that Quakers have been doing. I then felt like, okay, let me open up my space and not just look at my own immediate survival, but how do I move in a way that I can be proud of and that's building the world that I want to see?
That's beautiful. And I too have been nourished and supported by spiritual practice to be able to look at the challenges of our time. For example, for me, it's been more Buddhist practice, engaged Buddhism. But for example, there's a practice of Tonglen, or breathing through, and I use it every day when I read the news, where I'll listen to the news, and instead of letting it impact me and kind of stay in my head as a headache, or my shoulders as shoulder ache, right? Or my stomach as a stomach ache, because oftentimes it can be really hard to hear about the ecological, political, social crises of our time. So instead, what I do is I breathe it in and I cycle it through my heart, and I breathe out again loving kindness or compassion to those beings that are being impacted or who are suffering in that news story. And so, yeah, that's just one example of how I totally hear you, that spiritual practice can really ground us and strengthen us and support us to be able to do this work that we're doing and to be able to face the challenges of our time.
To be able to hold the grief, right? I know you're also connected. You're so connected with so many things. I'm so excited to see what a connector you are, at least from what I see in regenerative economics, but also with the Work That Reconnects. So that's another amazing resource. I went through one of their workshops last year at your recommendation, and one of the experiences that I thought was really helpful, again, in helping people stay in activism, was to consider it's the 7 generations exercise. Right, where you look 7 generations back, 7 generations forward. Would you mind giving people a snippet of that?
Yes. So the Work That Reconnects, coming from the root teacher, Joanna Macy, has all of these beautiful wisdom traditions woven in. And one that you're referring to is Indigenous wisdom, right? That looks at this longer frame of time, right? So much of the challenges of our time are due to our short-term thinking. We're really not thinking of the future generations. And we're also not considering our ancestors. So the 7th generation idea is to consider our actions, the impact of our actions on the 7th generation from now. And so how this practice works, and folks listening can really try this on, is that you imagine you're sitting in front of somebody of the 7th generation, and that they ask you a few questions. They ask you, when was it that you first realized that the industrial growth society was not working? What were the first steps that you took? And, what energizes you, or what grounds you to be able to do the work that you do? And then this other being, this person of the 7th generation, and this is using a practice of moral imagination. So your partner isn't actually of the 7th generation, they are just imagining they are. Their turn is to speak as if they were the 7th generation being to you as this present day being, giving you words of affirmation, of wisdom, of encouragement. And so there's this beautiful moment that's created in this practice, and people really receive it, as this person of the 7th generation talking to them. And so, yeah, it's just a really beautiful way to play with time and our sense of perspective, and our sense of really considering the impact of the 7th generation from now. And just to say one more thing, in the Work That Reconnects book by Joanna Macy, she has this quote from Sister Rosalie Bertell. She says, "Every being who will ever live is alive right now in our ovaries and gonads." So basically, the 7th generation is here right now, right? They are the beings that will come, are here right now. And this brings in that idea of not just, intergenerational trauma, but intergenerational healing, or what is it we might want to pass on, right? To the beings that come after us, whether we're biological parents or not, just to all the beings that come after us. How do we be good ancestors? So yeah, thanks for reminding us of that practice. It's a beautiful one.
And it's how do we be good ancestors? How do we see our interconnectedness and even our power? Again, when we're looking at problems that are systemic, I work with clients who are on two extremes of their finances. They're either struggling to get their finances set in order, or they're at the other extreme when I'm doing investment management, where they have more than enough and they're moving on, how do I invest this in a way with a positive social impact? But in both of these questions, the individuals can feel like just a tiny little portion, right? That their sphere of influence, regardless of the amount of money that they have, can feel small. And what I find really nourishing from your work and people who are looking at systemic level changes is seeing how we're all interconnected. How do you balance working when people have a small sphere of influence and also looking at systemic change? Because I know that's one of the things that your podcast really looks at. I feel like your podcast is really focused on systemic change. How can individuals take part in that while navigating their own full lives?
Yeah. So one thing that I check in with personally, but I also invite others to check in on, is balancing in our livelihood gardens. So for example, I might work with someone and they're a therapist and they're working with one-on-one, individuals. And oftentimes they find that work is fulfilling, but they don't feel like they're contributing at this larger scale, right? So then I might encourage them to investigate how might they both work one-on-one with someone, but then also contribute to that larger systemic change that they wish. So that's why I say balancing. Sometimes when or the opposite can happen, where somebody could be doing like policy work and like writing books and like really theoretical and really big picture, but really lose sight of like how their work is creating any like concrete material difference, right? Because it's like changing the goal of the economic system is such a vast ambition. It's important, but it's vast. And so for those people, I might say, could you go and pick up trash in your neighborhood, right? Or could you go volunteer locally? Like literally see that the work that you've done in mutual aid or in, planting trees literally makes a difference. Like you can see the difference that you make. So I'm playing with kind of scales and balancing. Another one that I look at personally and also work with others to look at is spheres of influence. So I ask myself, what am I doing in my neighborhood? What am I doing in my city? What am I doing in my state? What am I doing nationally? And what am I doing internationally? And again, when I'm in only one of those, I can feel kind of out of balance. And oftentimes that out of balance is a feedback sign to say, okay, I've been doing everything like super hyper locally, and I'm not really paying attention to what's happening abroad or what's happening at the national level. How might I contribute on that front? Right. So just to play with these scales can be useful, and finding when you do feel like out of balance, what is the complement that you could plant? What is the complementary plant in your livelihood garden that would meet that need to either contribute on a larger scale or more locally?
And I hear that invitation of having the person kind of do some self-reflection. Where am I moved to act, right? What's within my scope of things that I can do?
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the questions that I love asking people is, what was the financial background of your childhood? And how do you see it reflected in the work that you do today, if at all?
Yeah. So growing up, I grew up in San Francisco, and I guess it would be considered middle class family. Although, recognizing I'm in the global north, I'm in the United States, I'm in a settler colony, I'm white. So just recognizing all of the privilege that comes with all of that. I would say I was really grateful for scholarships to be able to go to the summer camps and also to even go to the high school that I went to, like grateful for all of that. I did have mixed experiences with both public school, like UC Davis is a public school, but also private schools like my high school. So different like variations of all of that. And so today, how might that have influenced me? I'm definitely like very aware of the elitism and the kind of difficulty of the kind of private education system, or the things that you have to pay for access to. Like I'm aware of how that can be exclusionary. And so one of the things that I really look at is, what is it we want to be on the market and what is it we don't want to be on the market, right? Like education or healthcare, for example. So just because I was able to pay for it or was able to receive support or scholarships to be able to pay for that, it still was apparent to me how many weren't able to. And so like I'm an advocate in this alternative economic space for, we could call it eco-socialism, but really just this like rethinking of the commons and of having universal basic services, and having people's needs met. This other piece around growing up in a settler colony and growing up in the United States, the way that that has impacted me is just becoming aware through people's work like Jason Hickel of just how so much of the comfort and material wealth that I've experienced has come at the expense of the global South. Right? This kind of unequal exchange. Like Jason Hickel really says, who's developing who? And it is not that the US and the global North has developed the global South. No, in terms of labor, in terms of wealth, in terms of resources, there has been more of a drain from the global South to the global North. So another way that has impacted me has really been becoming very interested in land back movements for Indigenous peoples, reparations for people of color in the United States, but also reparations globally. And then, of course, ending, U.S. imperialism or U.S. neocolonialism, which still exists to this day, the ways in which wealth and materials and labor is still being drained and taken from the global South to enrich the global North. So those are some things as to how my childhood experience, upbringing, layered with deeper understanding as I become an adult, has impacted the type of work that I do today.
Right. And one of the questions that I remember talking about this with a friend and hearing her very clearly say, like, I don't want it to be the way that it is, but I'm also not willing to change anything about what I consume. Like, I understand that the US, being a tiny portion of the global population, consumes a massive portion of resources. And there was this just knowing flat out that she did not want to change the way she consumed. Right. So it can be so difficult to manage that, because I remember like living in the US, growing up as a child of immigrants, the things that people expect in the US and the things that people expect in Mexico are so widely different. And I don't know how that would change for people in the US other than what you've gone through of like individually deciding to change it for yourself.
Well, a few things come up. One is this idea of our ecological footprint, which relates to what you're talking about, like our individual level of consumption, was actually created by the oil and gas industries to try to put the kind of onus of climate change and climate change responsiveness on the individual. When actually it is, of course, we each do have an impact ecologically, but it really is the systemic impact of corporations and of our systems that have the real impact on our climate. And so like I just find, yes, it is important to look at our own consumption, our own investments, as you do so well with your clients, but it's also important to change the systems of our production and consumption and transportation, education, at that level. So that's one point. But the other point that I'm inspired by is that in this post-growth economic system, going back to donut economics and all of this, if we are to say growth is no longer the end goal, but growth is a means to an end, the end goal is actually human and planetary well-being, then it is true that in some economies, there will need to be growth. So for example, in Mexico, there's likely a lot of places where people don't have access to clean water or adequate housing, education, etc. And there's not that much impact on the environment right now. And so growth is needed, right? Growth in the classic sense. And then there'll be other places, probably where I am in San Francisco, where we will need to degrow. We'll actually need degrowth. And so Jason Hickel, again, he has a great book called Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World. And what he does is he says, degrowth is actually a win-win. It's not so bad. So I'm speaking to the person that you were speaking to, that actually, having less, consuming less does not need to mean that we're living an impoverished life. There's actually ways that could actually be better for all of us. So let me give an example. Instead of buying a washing machine, a dishwasher, and a fridge, and the planned obsolescence that often comes within that they will fall apart within 5 or 10 years and I'll have to buy another one, we could move systemically towards from ownership to usership, where I rent those appliances and I utilize them. And when they no longer work, I return them to the manufacturer to change only the components that are broken, not to throw out the whole machine. You see what I'm saying? That's not any less, like, I'm still washing my dishes and having a refrigerator, right? But the systemic impact of that is lessened. Or another example, that I could have a childcare collective once I have a child, where I take care of the kids on Monday nights and my neighbor takes care of the kids on Tuesday nights. No money is exchanged, and yet kids have, time with their friends, with their neighbors, and parents get a little bit of, rest, right? Like, that's a degrowth, element to it. Sharing things more readily, right? Having libraries of things, a share shop. Like, I get to check out a popcorn machine or a cotton candy machine or a violin. I don't have to buy one. What if I don't like the violin, but I want to try it, right? So I'm just saying that to live in the places where we may need to consume less does not need to be a worse life. And in fact, it can be absolutely better for the planet and the environment, but it also can be better for us.
Right, especially in that it's creating more community. A lot of the examples you shared are about creating relationships, which at the end of the day will make people much happier than stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, money can solve money problems, but not a lot of other problems like relationships and quality of life and meaning. And I had a conversation with a friend yesterday who mentioned that people can reduce the amount of income that they need or work that they need to do if what they're really trying to have the income for, let's say it's adventure or relaxation, maybe they can figure out ways to go directly to adventure, directly to relaxation. For someone, it might be reading. Reading might create a lot of adventure for you. So then borrowing books from libraries, like, there's ways that we expect money to be able to solve some things. But when we really look at the thing that we're trying to get, the real value, it can be received in many other ways.
Absolutely.
And I love your reminder. I didn't actually know that it was the oil and gas industry that had created the carbon footprint, or ecological impact. Is that the term? But it reminds me of, there's so many ways that we are asking people to take ownership of things that are really much more systemic. I think of retirement plans. So 401ks, individual retirement accounts in the US, were developed in the 70s. Before that, corporations had the onus, they had the responsibility of taking care of their employees in old age. And corporations were like, oh, this is a huge liability on our end, especially as people are living longer. We moved it over to people. And one of the interesting things I've found, or I've learned, is that when we think of ourselves 5 years from now, I'm not even talking about somebody in a different part of the country, different part of the world, but like ourselves in 5 years, we have as much compassion and sympathy as we do for a stranger. Like, we have no idea who we are in 5 years. Like, it doesn't really matter. We're very much the way that we are wired. I don't know if it's biologically, but we're much more inclined to think about short term. So when we ask people to save for retirement and they're 22, we're asking them to be a different type of human.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that reminds me. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to even go further thank you for bringing up the history of that, is that it also assumes that in our older age that we must meet all our needs through financialized ways. And it is true. We live in a highly financialized system where our food needs, our housing needs, we have to meet through money. But there are other communities, and I'm thinking about Kristen Godsey's work. She wrote the book Everyday Utopia, where communities meet needs in other ways, to your point. And, like living in multi-generational families, right? Or even more community housing, right? Like investing in community so that in our older age, we are cared for by other people, right? And we don't have to pay for all our needs to be met. And yeah, so like this idea of who we are in our elder years and how we will meet our needs is something definitely to interrogate and question for sure.
And just a little bit more background on that. Like I think it's only been since the 30s, 40s that people have even had this idea of retirement. So I think what we're doing is we tried something out in the US of having people care for themselves wholeheartedly. It's worked for some, but not for most, like many things. And the examples that you shared, it sounds like a lot of things that are pre-industrial, right? What examples have you seen or are you seeing in the US of people trying out these new systems?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing, we're getting into the realm of prefigurative politics, right? Like ways that people can embody and practice the world that they want to see, right? To create that change. And I really see it in every area. Like I see it in housing. So there's communities around the world that are doing co-housing or, like a housing land trust where they're taking the value of the land off the market and they're just buying and selling properties and they're sharing more resources. Housing cooperatives are another example. In food and farming, there's alternative models. In the business or organizational realm, there's the worker cooperative, the worker self-directed nonprofit. In education, right? There's like the Steiner schools and the free schools, the unschooling, like there's so many things. So in every area of our life, there are people who are trying things differently. One of my favorite examples right now, I just got to read Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and then her more recent book, The Service Berry, which is all about learning from nature. And so, bringing in indigenous communities, again, to this day, but also in the past, ways that indigenous people have been living in right relationship with the earth and really embodying the gift economy, which is the central part of the more recent book that she's written. So yeah, I would say like in every area, you can look towards these more cooperative, more regenerative, whether it's gift economy, feminist economics, regenerative economics, tools and practices that people are embodying. And they may be at smaller scale, but we can also look at what are the policy changes and what are the movements that are really advocating for that systemic shift. It's also happening at the systemic level. So it really is happening at all levels.
I love that. I love the term prefigurative politics and the fact that you just lit up. You're like, there's so many ways that people are doing this. There's really, and they don't get a lot of attention though, right? Some of the places where they could get attention is like going to your podcast and hearing about it there, but also people just getting connected to their community and finding out what's happening locally. I remember when I was leaving Philadelphia, seeing a lot of fridges, like refrigerators that had extra food. It's kind of like a lending library or the lending libraries with books, extra food. Like creating a solidarity economy doesn't have to be a giant policy-wide change.
Yeah, it's both and, right? It's the everyday and how we meet our needs. And then it's that building that future that we want.
One of the questions that you suggested, it's a big question, but what do you see when you go upstream from the problems of our time?
So I've been on this journey since I was that rape crisis counselor back in the day. And what I've found through getting to really interview people and learn with and from people, including Kate Rayworth and also Joanna Macy, are that first you have the challenges of our time. So inequality, homelessness, climate change. The first stop upstream is like a system or a way of being that is inherently based on supremacies. So power over, you mentioned power. So power over dynamics. So this looks like white supremacy, global North supremacy over global South, patriarchal supremacy, human supremacy over nature, and many others. So this kind of like supremacies, power over culture. When we go upstream from that power over dynamic, we find separation from, because we cannot have power over unless we're separate from. To be separate from is the first stage, and then to exert power over. And so separation from. And when we go upstream from that separation, we find this idea that is really talked about a lot in mainstream economic thinking, this idea of who we are as humans, that we are Homo economicus, that we are rational, self-interested beings who maximize our own self-interest. And not only is that who we are, but that's actually what's better for the economy. And so this isolated, rugged individual self who's disconnected from other people, from our bodies, our cycles, our rhythms, our ancestors, the future beings, right? The seventh generation beings, but also we're disconnected from the more than human world, the web of life. And so that's kind of the root cause of the challenges of our time. And then if we want to go to the antidotes or the kind of invitations for the alternatives, the first stage is a different sense of self, a sense of self that is the eco self, the ecological self. And you can find this in indigenous spiritual traditions, right? Like this idea of other beings being kin, being all my relations. But you also can find this in eco-spiritual traditions, whether it's Buddhism or, eco-spiritual Christianity, etc. These traditions of seeing ourselves as more interconnected, as you brought up. And then from that ecological self, we have remembering or reconnection. So remembering ourselves to the web of life, remembering our ways of our ancestors, of our relationship with the seasons and of our ecologies, and also remembering ourselves to one another, like really seeing that interconnectedness of one another across borders and boundaries. And then from that comes a new sense of power, or a different sense of power, power with. And you brought up solidarity, right? Solidarity economics, solidarity economy. So a sense of power of solidarity, power with. And then coming from that are these alternative economics, right? This more regenerative, solidaristic, cooperative economic system. So that's the journey upstream that I've come to know from getting to go to places that have been embodying this, but also to ask these questions of, people who are really investigating this question.
I love that. So what I'm hearing as kind of just reflecting back, it's the idea that we're separate from each other is what creates the possibility of supremacy. But I am also an economist. I studied economics when I was in college, and I remember thinking it was all just fiction. It was kind of like psychology, but trying to add in numbers and adding in a lot of greed. I remember learning about macroeconomics and being like, this doesn't make sense with the way that people are. I'm also remembering a conversation that I had with a venture capitalist when I was asking him about what are the impact of these policies? And he swiped so much of it away just by calling it an externality. And a benefit that I've learned about people who identify as highly sensitive, and probably many, many people, is the fact that we can be so porous, the interconnectedness. If someone's losing while I'm winning, it automatically is lose-lose. Because I'm connected to this person, seeing someone experiencing hunger in a world where, according to Jason Hickel, it's not necessary. We could all be fed, we could all be housed. It's just frustrating and confusing. And yet, the mainstream idea is still so much about competition. I don't know if you're familiar with David Graeber's work around, he wrote this book that I think one of his last books was The Dawn of Everything, where he talks about how indigenous societies were before contact with the US.
So I'm familiar with his work on debt more so.
Okay.
Not that book. But what I will say is from Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, which is similar in the way that she talks about indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and alternative economies. So she offers things like the honorable harvest, the practice of the honorable harvest, where indigenous peoples will ask permission before foraging or harvesting. Mm. They will never take more than is needed. They will share, right? She has this beautiful story in her books about a linguist who went to the Amazon of Brazil and found that they were hunting and then sharing all the meat. And the linguist said, why are you doing that? That doesn't make economic sense. Why are you giving this all away? And the the indigenous person said, "I store my meat in the belly of my brother." So this idea of like, who do we invest in? Investing in community and storing our meat in the belly of our brother, not in our own, our own caves and our own cellars, so to speak. And so she also offers the idea of the potlatch ceremony from Northwest Indigenous communities in so-called Canada. But this idea of wealth being, how much do you have to give away? So not how much do you hoard, but wealth is actually, can you give a lot away? And the potlatch ceremony is an annual gathering where wealth is given away, right? So, I would say, learning from her book, this concept of the gift paradigm of this, like, practicing what is beneficial to the other and giving away and giving the gift as both an obligation, a responsibility, but also a sign of wealth and of value. Those are some of the things that I understand to be part of Indigenous economics or Indigenous culture.
Sticking with the theme of prefigurative politics, where we are right now in the US, it feels like things are falling apart, going backwards. Liberties are being stripped away. More people are in danger. How do we stay in a mindset of both prefigurative politics while continuing to protect what we have? What are some of the recommendations that you're giving your Right Livelihood clients in these times?
Yeah. Catherine Trebek, a well-being economist, she once said to me, we need to be aware of when our work is helping people survive today and when our work is helping people build tomorrow. And this is another one of those balancing where we right now need to both survive today for ourselves, right? We talked about the grief and the overwhelm that we may be feeling in the face of everything that's happening. So what are our resources, our spiritual practices, our connections with others that can help ground us and keep us, keep us present and keep us reactive and showing up at this time. So there's that. But then also, how do we help others survive today? So right now will be a time where we are needed to protest, where we are needed to support our, immigrant communities, our LGBT communities, our ecosystems, our forests, because they are under threat, right? They are under attack right now. And we can't just help people survive today and ourselves survive today. We also must think about, how do we build tomorrow? Prefigurative politics is part of that, embodying that future that we want to build and practicing those skills and those ways of being now, but also that systemic change, right? So how do we build the movements, right? The political movements, the social movements that don't just resist, but actually build that transformation that is needed. So again, it's a balancing and it's a both and at this time.
Right. And it's giving of our time, for people who are able to, sharing their resources. It's just creating, it's also like embodying that idea of, or moving away from separation and moving more into our interconnectedness. One of the things that we haven't dived into this, but when I work with people on their finances, one of the questions that I often have is like, what will be enough? What will feel like enough? What expenses, what money expenses do you need your money to cover? And how will you know that you've reached that? And then people often, one of my favorite topics is the question of enough, because I've seen so many people struggle with lifestyle creep. What was enough before changes. I think we all experienced what was enough when I was in college. Now, 20 years later, I couldn't imagine living on what I was living then. And funny enough, I had an experience of feeling that I understood what enough would be was at a silent retreat, where in thinking about the slowness of my life, that we were just meditating, the 3 meals that we were having, I had the sense that in order for people to actually feel like they had enough, it wasn't so much about what they had today, but about knowing that their needs would be taken care of in the future. The current systemic setup that we're in is not set up like that at all. It's so much more about competition. And I love what you're sharing about, donut economics specifically, about everyone's well-being being considered, about universal basics being something that we can just relax into. Then I think lifestyle creep, we wouldn't be asking money to be taking care of those kind of things. It would be so much easier to care for each other.
Yeah, no, I also really love this idea of enoughness and investigating it, and even asking questions around gratitude and enoughness are radical acts in our current economic system. And the main teacher for me around enoughness is Manfred Max-Neef, the Chilean economist who is famous for something called barefoot economics. And what he offers what are called the fundamental human needs. And he offers them in a circle, not a pyramid. So not Maslow's pyramid, but a circle of fundamental human needs. In his work, he goes to a community, or he I think he's passed away, but he would go to a community and he would say, how well are your needs being met? And people could kind of shade them in on an individual, but also a community level. You could then ask, what are these needs being met in financialized ways? Which are the needs that you have to have money to meet this need? So again, I was saying about housing, food, there's a few needs that we need money to meet our needs. But then he introduced that we have satisfiers, which are ways that we meet our needs. We have synergistic satisfiers, ways that we meet our own need, but also another need in like a mutual way. What are violators? Meaning we try to meet a need, but we violate another one of our other needs. And pseudo-satisfier, ways that we attempt to meet a need, but we don't actually meet it. So for example, if I'm meeting my need for belonging through social media, it may not actually meet that need, maybe an attempt, it may be a pseudo-satisfier. But the reason why I bring this up is because I use it to find enoughness for folks. I have them shade this in, identify how much they currently need to make to be able to meet these needs. And then I ask them, what are the ways that they could meet these needs in non-monetized ways? In solidarity economy, gift economy, sharing economy ways. And we can often find really creative and win-win ways that we can meet these needs in non-monetized ways, such as a childcare collective, as I mentioned, or gardening for food needs. And then what that does is it creates both a sense of how much is enough, but it can also lessen the pressure of our work, how much work we need to do to meet these needs. And we can find ways that are not just meeting of our needs, but are synergistic for our communities, ways that are helping our communities meet their needs. So yeah, just affirming, even just talking about enoughness, finding our point of enoughness, and doing this needs assessment is so critical. So yeah, thank you for that beautiful question.
Yes, I love this. You've given us so many wonderful resources. Manfred Max-Neef, Barefoot Economics. I'll look that up. Thank you. As we're wrapping up, are there any topics or questions that you'd like to bring in?
I guess I'm just, appreciating your background and, just this question of investment comes up. Like, what are we investing in? And one other thing that I find helpful right now are thinking about the 8 capitals, right? Or regenerative capitals. So not just the financial. And so what are all the things we want to invest in right now? And Charles Eisenstein, who wrote the book Sacred Economics, he once said the number one thing we can invest in right now is community. And I think this goes to what we were talking about with, the challenges of our time. We have, retirement. It just weaves into so much of what we've talked about, that, getting to know our neighbors, investing in our community, that yes, it is important to have savings and it is important to have enoughness financially and to have retirement. But it's also important to have the strength of the ties of our community, not in an exchange oriented way, like you do something for them so that they do something for you, but so when we continue to face the challenges, whether it's ecological or political or social, that we know each other, that we know each other's names, that we know each other's phone numbers, that we can, call each other, request for help when we need it. We can reach out when we need it. We can offer help when we can. So I just want to, maybe close with, rethinking investment in this more broader sense, and really thinking of ourselves as, when we reframe capital, not just as financial, but in these like 8 capitals, which include cultural, social, ecological, we actually find that we're much more wealthy than we thought we were, right? So I just wanted to share that and see if you have anything to add by way of, investment advice, quote unquote, as we close our conversation.
Well, you made the comment earlier that so many things have been financialized, right? Like childcare, elder care, healthcare, all of it has to do with money and investing. We can often forget that, yeah, like you said, the investing in our capital, in our community can create so much more peace for ourselves and also for others. One of the beautiful things that I find in a lot of immigrant communities is that expectation or that responsibility to always take care of your elders. And I know you're also taking part of that with your mom right now. And it can create a sense of ease to know that somebody will be there for you, but also a sense of belonging and pride that you can do it for others. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today, for all the expertise that you've shared today and like these other teachers that you follow, and for the way that you weave everything together. It always feels like such a balm when I talk to you, whenever I have questions around right livelihood. And I'm excited to see you in your next phase as a parent and see the decisions and the new ideas that you create from that, and that you also enjoy it.
Thank you so much. And I really did enjoy this conversation. So thank you. And thank you for the work that you do.
As we close this conversation, I'm sitting with the reminder that reimagining our economy isn't just about policy or numbers. It's about remembering who we are to each other. Della offered so many invitations to rethink success, to explore enoughness, and to recognize how our deepest needs might be met, not just through money, but through connection, community, and care. I keep thinking about the idea that gratitude and sufficiency are radical acts in a system built on scarcity. We can hold grief and beauty at the same time. And spiritual grounding, whether through Buddhist practices or Quaker silence, or simply through breathing through the overwhelm, can help us stay open without collapsing. It was such a pleasure having Della Duncan join us today. Her clarity, her integrity, and her vision for a more just and regenerative world leaves me inspired. I hope you walk away from this episode with a renewed sense of possibility and that you follow her work over at Upstream Podcast. Thank you for joining me on Highly Sensitive Money. I'm Diana Giselle Yanez, and I hope this episode helped you see how money and sensitivity can work together while honoring our interconnected well-being. We have the power to create a system where everyone's needs are met because nature is abundant. If you found value in today's conversation, please take a moment to leave a review and share this episode with someone who could benefit. Your support helps this message reach more people navigating their own financial journeys. A thank you goes to Mike Schul for the music and Juan Antonio Nunez for producing. For more resources on bringing money and social justice together, sign up for my monthly newsletter over at allthecolors.net. I also invite you to schedule a free 30-minute call where we can talk about money coaching, investment management, and all things money and social justice. Until next time, remember that your sensitivity and deep thinking is your superpower.